I still remember the sound of crystal glasses clinking, the laughter bouncing off the marble walls of that grand ballroom, the smell of roasted duck and expensive wine filling the air. It was supposed to be my 8th wedding anniversary, a milestone, a celebration. We had reserved the entire hall of a Manhattan hotel, the kind where the chandeliers look like frozen waterfalls. My family was there, my colleagues, even a few neighbors who thought they had been invited to witness an evening of love and stability. I stood near the head table, fingers brushing against the thin leather folder where I had tucked away the dinner program. My heart was calm. I had dressed carefully, a dark gown that made me feel like myself again after months of unease. I was ready for a night that might stitch together what had started to unravel. Then the doors opened. My spouse, let me just call them that because the word partner feels too soft, now walked in holding hands with someone else. A stranger to me, though not to them. A younger face glowing with a confidence that only comes from believing you are about to win something. They walked straight down the aisle of tables like they were making an entrance at a wedding, not crashing an anniversary. No one breathed. Forks froze midair. The two of them stopped at the microphone. My spouse cleared their throat, looked directly at me, and announced, "Starting tonight, this marriage is open. Half of your $1 million savings should cover my freedom." The words cut through the room like a blade. I could see people's jaws drop. Someone at the back spilled wine onto their white dress shirt. My grip tightened around the folder, the stiff paper edges pressing into my palm. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream. Instead, I stood still, letting the silence settle like dust after an explosion. There is something peculiar about public humiliation. It does not feel like fire. It feels like ice crawling up your back, chilling you until you almost forget to breathe. And while the crowd waited for me to break, I chose not to give them that satisfaction. The stranger beside my spouse shifted uncomfortably. They had been promised a scene of liberation, not the awkward stares of 100 guests. I watched them glance down at the folder in my spouse's hand, some sort of mock legal document, maybe a prenup copy waved like proof of ownership. I did not shout. I did not throw my wine glass. I simply folded my hands over the dinner program and whispered inside my own mind, "So this is how you wanted to play it." The applause never came, but murmurs spread across the room. My mother-in-law's hand rose to cover her mouth. A cousin pulled out their phone, pretending to check messages but angling the camera at us. That was the first spark of what would later become a viral video. I sat down, smoothed the fabric of my gown, and let the silence continue. What people rarely admit is that betrayal has a taste. It tastes like copper, like the pennies you held in your mouth as a child, and I could taste it that night, stronger than the wine I had not yet sipped. The microphone screeched slightly as my spouse added, "It is time for excitement. You should be grateful to be part of this arrangement." That was the insult that burned hotter than the rest. Grateful. As though my years of paying the mortgage on our $2 million penthouse, covering car payments, balancing credit cards, and building a 6-figure savings account were nothing but background noise. I glanced around the room. Some guests tried to smile, to pretend this was an eccentric toast. Others whispered behind menus. And there I sat still, almost invisible. But what they didn't know was that I had seen hints of this betrayal long before tonight. Late nights at the office, whispered phone calls, receipts tucked carelessly into coat pockets. I had chosen silence, hoping dignity might survive where passion had failed. Tonight, silence would serve me again, but in a different way. I will explain in a moment. For now, let me leave you with this humiliation. When endured without flinching, can turn into a weapon sharper than any insult. My spouse thought they had destroyed me in front of a ballroom filled with witnesses. What they had done instead was light a fuse. Tell me where you are watching from, and do not forget to subscribe. We need to talk about families' money and what happens when betrayal walks into a ballroom hand in hand with arrogance. The waiter set down a glass of wine in front of me. I pushed it aside. My throat was dry, but I wanted my head clear. Across the table, my spouse laughed too loudly, the sound bouncing off the chandelier as though to convince everyone this spectacle was simply modern love, nothing to be ashamed of. The stranger, let us call them the guest, shifted in their chair, tugging at a too tight collar. I folded my hands, leaned back, and let the weight of the room settle on their shoulders instead of mine. The ballroom was hushed, but hushed in that dangerous way when people pretend to enjoy themselves, yet their ears are tuned to every whispered word. My cousin caught my eye mouth, something like, "Are you all right?" I nodded once. I wanted no pity. Separated, the guest muttered when I asked how long they had been seeing my spouse. Their cheeks reddened, They glanced at my spouse as though begging for confirmation. Separated, I repeated, my voice calm, steady, almost gentle. That is interesting, because I have been paying the mortgage on our penthouse, the car loans, the credit cards, and even your salary at my company this entire time. A ripple moved through the tables, a rustle of silk and polished shoes. The guest blinked, realization dawning that they had been lured into a fantasy. My spouse's smile faltered just slightly. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. With a few taps, I slid it across the white linen tablecloth screen, glowing. You might find this interesting, I said to the guest. Every meeting, every hotel, rendezvous logged as client consultations. Dates, times, invoices, a perfect pattern of deceit. The guest leaned forward, their face drained of color. My spouse froze hand halfway to the wine glass. You told me you were free, the guest whispered. You told me the marriage was already over. I let the silence answer for me. Silence was my ally. The room shifted again. Guests leaned closer, pretending to check their phones while recording clips. The murmurs grew louder like bees in a hive disturbed by smoke. My spouse finally snapped. Do not be dramatic. Dramatic, I repeated, placing my hands on the table. Number. This is not drama. This is documentation. I gestured toward the ballroom's polished oak doors. On Monday morning, Human Resources will receive a full report. Conflict of interest, client misconduct, misuse of company resources. The policy is clear. Termination follows immediately. That was when the guest pushed back their chair. You never told me any of this. You said you were financially independent, that you had your own savings. The lie hung between them. I did not need to say a word. But I did softly. I guess you have learned that independence is expensive when someone else is footing the bill. The guest stood, jacket sliding off the back of the chair. I cannot do this. I am not part of your games. Their voice shook, but the words carried through the ballroom. They looked at my spouse one last time. You lied to me about everything, your money, your marriage, your freedom. Then they left their footsteps, echoing like a gavel strike. My spouse's face was pale, their hands trembling. I picked up my phone, slipped it back into my clutch, and stood. The check, I informed the hostess as I passed, would be under their name. Behind me, voices swirled, some sympathetic, some scandalized, some thrilled by the spectacle, but I walked steadily, head high, through the sea of stares. Outside, the air was cool. I breathed it in, filling my lungs with something that tasted like freedom, though bitter at the edges. The streetlight gleamed against the hood of my car, a reminder that I still had control over what was mine. What the crowd did not know, what even my spouse did not realize, was that this was only the beginning. I will tell you that part soon. The morning after the anniversary debacle, my phone did not stop buzzing. Messages stacked like dominoes, falling one after another. Cousins, uncles, in-laws, all with their versions of sympathy or accusation. Some wanted gossip, others wanted to console, but most simply wanted to know which side of the battlefield they should stand on. By noon, my spouse's parents called. Their voices were sharp, dripping with disappointment, not for the betrayal their child had committed, but for the scene I had caused. You should have handled it privately, the mother scolded as though I were an unruly teenager. Family matters are not meant for microphones. Family matters, I asked quietly. Did you hear your child announce to a ballroom that half of my savings belongs to them? Did you hear them declare freedom while holding someone else's hand? There was a pause then. The father spoke, his tone even colder. Marriage requires sacrifice. Perhaps you have not been enough excitement for them. I held the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen as though the words might rewrite themselves. Then I ended the call without a goodbye. That afternoon, I opened the family group chat. I attached photos, mortgage statements, credit card bills, joint account withdrawals, all in my handwriting, all with my signature. Beneath them, I typed, if you call this separation, then perhaps you should also call theft generosity. For a few minutes, the chat was silent. Then messages began. A cousin replied with a shocked emoji. An aunt asked if this was really necessary. The mother-in-law typed, do not humiliate us further. And finally, a sister-in-law wrote, maybe you should learn to be more supportive. Everyone deserves happiness. That last message stung more than I wanted to admit. Supportive. As though my years of paying every bill were not support enough. As though my silence in the face of suspicion had not been a gift. Late in the evening, a private text appeared from an unknown number. It read, "You are not the only one paying. Ask them where the hotel money came from." I stared at the words until the letters blurred. Hotel money. I opened my laptop, logged into our joint account again. The withdrawals matched what I had already known, but there were extra charges disguised under vague labels. I cross-checked with receipts saved in my email folder. The pattern was undeniable. My spouse had been funneling money not only from our shared savings, but also from a secondary account I had nearly forgotten existed. And some of that money had gone directly into the guests' hands, cash transfers, hidden under the description of consultation fees. I leaned back in my chair, letting the glow of the screen cast shadows on the walls of my penthouse. My home, my sanctuary now filled with the echo of deceit. What weighed on me most was not the loss of money, but the smug certainty with which they had flaunted it. They truly believed that my dignity would crumble under the weight of family shame. But what they did not know was that shame can harden into steel. I poured myself a glass of water, steadying my hands. The family had chosen their jury role, and it was clear they were not on my side. Fine, I no longer needed them. I had evidence, I had silence sharpened into a weapon, and I had a lawyer who owed me a favor. And the stranger who had slipped away from the ballroom. They were not finished in this story either, because people who feel betrayed often speak louder than those who pretend loyalty. I will explain how that unfolded soon. On Monday morning, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Taxis honked sidewalks filled with people rushing to offices. Baristas poured lattes into paper cups. But my phone told a different story. By the time I opened my eyes, the viral clip from the anniversary dinner had already reached 1 million views. Someone had filmed the exact moment my spouse declared the marriage open and demanded half my savings. The internet is a cruel mirror. Strangers debated whether I was weak for staying silent or powerful for refusing to cry. Some replayed the clip frame by frame, pausing at my calm face, calling me stone-hearted. Others mocked my spouse's arrogance, their smug smile frozen mid-sentence. Hashtags appeared: open marriage disaster, saving scandal, penthouse betrayal. I did not comment. Silence was still my ally. Instead, I dressed carefully, black suit, hair tied back, and walked into my office as though I were carrying a shield. Colleagues tried to avoid staring, but whispers followed me down the hall. By noon, I was sitting across from Human Resources, sliding a folder across the table. Inside, copies of emails, client contracts, timestamps of consultations that had taken place in hotel rooms. Every receipt was highlighted, every suspicious charge marked. The HR director flipped through the papers, lips pressed tight. "This is serious," she murmured. "It is also conflict of interest," I replied. "Your policy is clear." Her eyes met mine, and in that look I saw confirmation. My spouse had not just broken vows, they had broken contracts. And contracts have consequences sharper than heartbreak. By the afternoon, the stranger from the ballroom, called me. Their voice was unsteady. "I did not know," they insisted. "They told me you two were done, that you were clinging to something already dead." I listened, said nothing. "They used me," the guest continued. "But they also used you. If you want my testimony, you have it." It was a strange alliance born from betrayal, but I accepted it. Sometimes enemies of enemies make the strongest witnesses. That evening, as I walked through the lobby of my penthouse, the doorman handed me a stack of letters. Among them was a notice: the company was suspending my spouse pending investigation. A suspension was just the first step. Termination was inevitable. Meanwhile, the viral video had grown. Late-night talk shows made jokes about it. Commentators dissected the arrogance of demanding half of $1 million savings while standing beside a lover. My spouse had wanted applause in that ballroom. Instead, they had earned ridicule across the nation. I poured a glass of red wine, stood at the window, and looked out over the city lights. Betrayal had turned public, and humiliation had been magnified 1,000-fold. But what they did not yet realize, what none of them realized, was that I was only warming up. Because when betrayal meets evidence, it does not end with a suspension. It ends with collapse. The next morning, I walked into a cafe where the smell of burnt espresso clung to the walls, and the hum of conversation felt oddly comforting. Waiting at the corner table was James, my old college friend, who had become a divorce attorney. He had already ordered black coffee, the kind he always drank during exam weeks, and when he saw me, he shook his head slowly. "I saw the video," he said, sliding a folded newspaper across the table. On the front page was a still frame from the ballroom clip. My spouse frozen mid-sentence, hand raised, demanding half of my savings. Cold James muttered, "Even for divorce standards." I sat down, pulling out a folder thicker than the one I had given Human Resources. "It gets better," I told him. "Conflict of interest with a $200,000 client contract. Misuse of company funds. And I want the penthouse deed secure. All $2 million worth." James's eyebrows rose. He flipped through my evidence page by page, tapping a pen against his teeth. "You have them cornered," he said finally. "And the public humiliation. That viral clip? We can use it as character evidence. Judges hate arrogance." I leaned back, breathing in the bitter coffee air. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. But James was not finished. He pulled out his tablet, showing me a trending article. Headlines blared, "Open marriage disaster when money meets betrayal." The ballroom scandal was no longer gossip. It had become news. "This works in your favor," James explained. "Public perception can sway negotiations. They will not want this dragged into court. They will fold quickly once they see the odds." I nodded, though part of me relished the thought of a courtroom spectacle. Let the world see how humiliation could be repaid. Later that evening, back at my penthouse, I pored over the paperwork James had given me. Legal language wrapped itself around my mind like vines, clauses, stipulations, asset protections. The most important part was clear: the penthouse purchased with my funds would remain mine. The joint accounts would be audited. And my spouse would leave with nothing but the echo of their own arrogance. That night, as I scrolled through social media, I noticed something strange. Among the thousands of comments mocking my spouse, there were a few anonymous accounts defending them, claiming I had starved the marriage of love, that I had cared only for money. The tone was too familiar, too defensive. It had to be them or someone close trying to rewrite the narrative. I smiled faintly. Lies do not stand long against receipts, and I had more than enough receipts. Before going to bed, I drafted one final message in the family group chat: "Legal proceedings begin tomorrow. Consider this your official notice. Next time you hear from me, it will be through counsel." No one replied. Silence once again was the loudest answer. But what they didn't know was that the silence had shifted. It was no longer theirs to weaponize. It was mine. And soon that silence would break in court. The following week, the courthouse corridors smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, a mix of bureaucracy and old grudges. I carried a leather portfolio tucked under my arm, filled with every piece of proof I had gathered: emails, receipts, statements, and the viral clip downloaded in pristine quality. My heels clicked steadily on the tile floor. Each step sounded like a drumbeat of inevitability. But before the hearing even began, I set a different stage. I forwarded the video and the receipts to my spouse's parents. I knew they still clung to an image of their child as a saintly figure who attended church every Sunday, a devoted spouse, a respectable professional. That illusion shattered the moment they opened their inbox. By nightfall, I received a call from the mother-in-law. Her voice was trembling. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. "You raised someone who chose to betray me," I answered calmly. "If the truth humiliates you, then perhaps you should ask why lies comforted you for so long." She hung up. That silence was more satisfying than any argument. Meanwhile, the guest, the younger lover, who had walked into the ballroom hand in hand, sent me a series of emails. They admitted everything. They confessed that my spouse had promised them security had slipped cash into their account, from what was supposed to be our joint savings. They felt used, discarded. And now they wanted revenge too. I could have ignored them, but their testimony was a sharp blade. Together, our stories painted not just betrayal, but fraud. As the case built, social media became my unexpected ally. TikTok edits layered dramatic music over the viral clip. Commentators ridiculed my spouse's arrogance, comparing them to fictional villains. Even late-night television ran jokes. Imagine inviting your mistress to your anniversary dinner. What kind of open bar was that? The laughter of strangers was not healing, but it was justice of a peculiar sort. My spouse had wanted to be admired. Instead, they had become a punchline. Inside my penthouse, I cut away the remnants of their presence. I changed passwords, closed accounts, froze credit cards. One by one, the ties unraveled until only my name remained on the deeds, the statements, the keys. Then came the twist I had not anticipated. An email arrived from an anonymous address attaching copies of debt records. Not my debts, my spouse's. Hidden loans, unpaid credit lines, balances quietly ballooning under their name. The guest had not just been a distraction. They had been a drain pulling money out of shadows I had not noticed. I stared at the documents, a bitter laugh escaping. They had not only betrayed me emotionally, they had been sinking us financially, dragging my hard-earned savings into their abyss. I forwarded the file to James, my lawyer. His reply was swift. This changes everything. We will argue financial misconduct. They may leave with nothing, and possibly debt responsibility. That night, I stood at the tall glass windows of my penthouse, the city lights blinking like conspirators. The skyline stretched before me, vast and untouchable. For the first time, I felt the scale of my revenge. It was no longer personal. It was public, financial, legal, and irreversible. What they didn't know was that collapse had a sound. It is not thunder, not screaming. It is the quiet click of a judge's pen signing an order. And that sound was coming soon. The courthouse was colder than I remembered. Perhaps it was the marble floors, or perhaps it was the air of finality that followed us down the hallway. I arrived with James, my lawyer, and a briefcase that seemed heavier than its weight should allow. Inside were the deeds, the mortgage statements, the account records, and a flash drive containing the infamous viral clip. My spouse was already there, sitting stiffly at the other table. They looked smaller somehow, as though the arrogance had been pressed out of them. No lover sat beside them now. The guest, once paraded like a prize, had already submitted sworn testimony against them. The judge called us to order. Papers shuffled, pens scratched. My spouse's attorney tried to paint a picture of emotional neglect of a partner too focused on finances. But James calmly slid forward the evidence, emails marked with timestamps. During work hours, hotel receipts paid, with company funds, credit transfers, labeled consultations. The judge frowned, tapping a pen, and this they asked, pointing to the still frame of the ballroom video projected on a screen. That, James said evenly, is the respondent announcing to over 100 witnesses that $500,000 savings account belonged to them by right. It was not a private conversation. It was a public claim of ownership over funds that were not theirs. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the court stenographer paused, glancing up from her machine. Then came the financial records, the hidden debts. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. So not only was the respondent misusing marital funds, but they were also concealing substantial debt obligations. James nodded. Correct. And my client has carried the burden of every mortgage payment on a $2 million penthouse, every car loan, and every credit card bill, alone. It was not rage that passed over my spouse's face, then it was fear. Raw, unmasked, undeniable. They looked at me as though pleading eyes, glossy lips trembling. Please, they whispered just loud enough for me to hear. We can work this out, we can fix it. I kept my gaze steady. Work it out, I said softly. You destroyed it with your own hands. You tried to humiliate me in front of everyone I know. There is no fixing that. The judge scribbled notes, then delivered the decision with the sound of a gavel. The penthouse deed remained mine. The savings accounts were declared untouchable. The debts were theirs alone to carry. Spousal support was denied on grounds of misconduct. The courtroom exhaled. I felt my shoulders lighten as though a weight I had carried for years had finally slipped away. When it was over, I walked past them without a word. They reached out, fingers twitching, but I did not stop. Outside, the sky was gray, the air crisp. I pulled my coat tighter around me and stepped into the street. Humiliation had been turned inside out. What began as an attempt to strip me of dignity had ended with them stripped of everything: love, money, respect, and reputation. And still, it was not the end. There was one final chapter, and it was mine to write. The first evening alone in the penthouse felt strange. Not empty, never that. The room still carried the warmth of the life I had built, the artwork on the walls, the scent of polished wood, the view of the skyline stretching across Manhattan like a glittering tapestry, but it felt lighter, as if the very walls had exhaled with me when the door closed behind their absence. I poured a glass of red wine, letting the deep color swirl against the glass. From the window, I could see the city, pulsing cars, moving like veins of light, towers glowing like sentinels. For years, I had built this place brick by brick, payment by payment, until the deed bore only my name. Now no one could question that it was mine. News outlets kept replaying the courtroom summary. Talk shows rehashed the scandal, replaying the clip of my spouse announcing their open marriage as though it were comedy. Strangers debated online whether I had been cruel or just. Some called me cold, others called me wise. But I had learned that strangers' opinions mattered little when one could look in the mirror and finally see strength instead of doubt. That night, I opened the family group chat once more. Messages still lingered from weeks before accusing, dismissing, shaming. I typed one line: "Truth will always outlive lies." Then I left the group. Silence this time was mine, to give, not theirs to impose. Days turned into weeks. My spouse drifted into obscurity, their debts dragging them further down. The guests disappeared from public view, likely nursing their own regrets. And I began to live. Slowly, deliberately. I bought fresh flowers for the penthouse each week. I learned to cook dishes I had once thought too complicated. I rediscovered books that had sat unopened for years. One evening, as I stood by the window again, wine in hand, I thought of the moment in that ballroom when humiliation was meant to destroy me. Instead, it had become the first stone in the foundation of something stronger. Betrayal, I realized, does not define you. What defines you is the way you carry its weight, the way you refuse to let it break your spine. I had carried it quietly, then turned it outward sharp enough to cut through arrogance and deceit. So if you ask me whether revenge heals, I will tell you this revenge is not about healing. It is about balance. And balance, once restored, brings a peace deeper than forgiveness. Now, as the city hums beneath my window, I raise my glass. To silence, to dignity, to the long winding path from betrayal to clarity. If you believe I made the right choice, comment right. If you think there is a sharper way to seek revenge, share your idea below.